let's look at the pros and cons of working with a therapist. And the somewhat surprising thing is there are a number of negatives about working with a therapist. And so it is a really good kind of assessment to make. Now, it is you should absolutely become highly trauma literate before working with a therapist, in part, in my opinion, because many therapists are not trauma literate, and they may just throw on the word on their website, trauma. And I found it, quite interesting that I had worked with, I would say, 40 healers of various kinds. So some of these were, energy healers, Reiki practitioners, acupuncturists, chiropractors, this therapist, that therapist, coaching, voice consulting around, finding, one's true self and bringing it out into the world. So, a whole range of different experiences, couples therapists, etc. And I found it quite startling that once I learned what trauma was from a stranger in a cafe, I just sat down at a cafe table. I said, "What's interesting and rich in your life?" The young man said he was going to a trauma workshop. I said, "What's trauma?" Because I kind of had the sense that it had to do with military concussions and, bombs, blowing off in short proximity. And so I didn't think trauma had anything to do with me. And this just speaks to the level of illiteracy. But once I learned what trauma was, and read the books by Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine, then I realized that not only did I have complex PTSD from childhood, not only had I demonstrated repeated trauma symptoms and expressed them to various therapists and practitioners in the field. I remember telling one in particular that I was getting really frustrated that whenever I was alone on this one job site that was high in the mountains, I would freeze and find a very difficult time moving in my body. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, and I couldn't solve the issue. And so I just brought people to the job site so I wouldn't be alone, and then I could move again. And I found this enraging, and puzzling, because it's like 80-90% of my energy would just disappear as soon as I was alone on this job site. And the therapist just looked at me and said, "Oh, very interesting. Next, come in and tell me more next week." And that was that. And I was not even aware of the fight, flight, freeze dynamic. And so the fact that I was going to a therapist, and they said, just come back and talk about it next week, left me with the false impression that I was doing what I should be doing to respond to what I didn't even have a name for at the time, which was trauma. And this was after, so this is, this conversation is happening, at about the 35, person in therapy. And the word has never come up in all of this therapeutic work. And so it's, that's alarming to me. It's alarming that I could work with 40 practitioners, demonstrate traumatic signs, and not have a single person recommend a book. It's more alarming that many of the trauma, many of the things that had a traumatic core to them, I would talk about, and sometimes leave the therapy session feeling much worse, and not be helped. So actually be paying money to feel worse with an ignorant therapist who was ignorant of their own ignorance And so when I'd give them a little pushback, like, I'm feeling worse after some of your sessions, that they would get defensive, rather than, acknowledge their own ignorance about their own ignorance or give a refund or anything like that. And so this is difficult things. So these are, big concerns about, the therapeutic landscape. Now, admittedly, because I didn't know what the word meant, because I didn't know what the symptoms were, I hadn't read a book about trauma. My only references would be like on the news, trauma, PTSD, veterans, and so I'd hear that. And so I didn't seek out a trauma therapist specifically because I didn't know I was traumatized. And that's really where the professionals need to be able to recognize the symptoms and say, you may not need me, you may need a trauma therapist. But I've never found the professional that did that. And so that's a concern, and it's one of the reasons that I think you should be educated. Now, I think it's unhealthy that in our system of recovery, it usually starts in childhood with teachers, bullies, and parents and older siblings abusing the most vulnerable. And then this develops a variety of problems, and then that's punished and shamed and ostracized, which creates more problems, which tends to make it harder to make an income, which creates more problems. And then to cap it all off, our solution to that incredible imbalance is to charge our trauma survivors hundreds of dollars an hour to fix what was done to them through the ignorance and shame and abuse within the culture. This doesn't make any sense, and so I don't like the idea of charging the survivor the bill for being scapegoated by the culture. The second thing, as Bessel van der Kolk explores in The Body Keeps the Score, is that talk therapy can be re-triggering and re-traumatizing. If you are with an ignorant therapist who doesn't understand this, and none of my therapists did, they will do what they always do. Tell me about it. And they will charge you to re-trigger yourself, and then they will end the session, often when you're in a highly aroused state, because of their schedule. This is also part of the underlying abuse, which is the message that you're not as important as the authority, as the big person. When you're an infant, a child, etc., you're relating to the big people. So when the therapist is giving that message, you drive to me at this time and show up, re-trigger yourself so that I can feel like I'm doing my job, and then cut it off regardless of your arousal state because of my schedule, and then just disappear for a week and come back and do it again. It's darkly comical in how sociopathic that protocol is, and it's very difficult to get a therapist to address it. I actually asked to interview therapists for documentaries around this abuse. Not a single therapist wanted to be interviewed, which you see is this imbalance. Like, we want you to pay us hundreds of dollars to tell us your most vulnerable things, whether we know what we're doing or not, and come to our place. We're not going to come to you. Come to our place, pay us, and open up completely. But when it comes to us opening up about our work for the public interest, no, we're not interested. It's kind of an imbalance in intimacy as well. And it's worth noting that many therapists have deeply abusive histories, deeply traumatic histories, which is what drew them to psychology in the first place. Is they're in so much pain and confusion in various things. They want to understand what's going on, and once they learn all that, then they put out a shingle to help other people. But it is a sad dynamic if a client is willing to pay money, even to an incompetent therapist, but a therapist is not willing to show up in public documentary for free in order to educate the public and share some of these technologies to help the most vulnerable people in our culture. There's something very askew with the level of narcissistic self-centeredness. And that's a cultural phenomenon. The culture is incredibly narcissistic when it comes to sacrificing people for abuse and then not wanting to cover the bill and the real consequences of that. Passivity can reinforce the message that this is not a big deal. One of the reasons that people are so sick is that abuse is often masked as being normal or okay or being tough or whatever it is. We're going to abuse you, and then rather than say we're sorry for abusing you, we're going to say be tough, or it's your fault for having feelings, or something like that. And the message is that the pain and the abuse is okay. I noticed after the sexual abuse of one therapist and then the cover-up by other therapists, I noticed that that the passivity of yet new therapists to hearing about that drove me wild. Because there wasn't a single therapist after the fact that said, where's that therapist license number? How can we make sure they don't damage other people? This is terrible. Let's get you some support to prosecute a lawsuit or whatever. None of that. Every therapist post-therapeutic abuse basically said, I'm doing my job. I'm sitting here taking notes, collecting my fee, and you should just move on. You shouldn't protect the other victims, anything like that. It's like it never occurred to them. And this passivity can reinforce the message, you don't matter, the abuse doesn't matter. It's no big deal. Therapists matter more than you, in other words. And that is an incredibly destructive, disempowering message. Because, of course, in a healthy dynamic, the client matters more than anyone else, and everyone is in service of that. But the way that therapy is set up, one of my tensions with therapy, even the good therapy, that worked, was it was often quite stressful as a contractor to try and predict how my day would be going on the construction site, to know, if maybe pulling off work at that particular time might leave a crew unsupervised at a key point, or require an hour's drive in and out of traffic. And, so income is going down. The therapist's income is going up. My income is going down. Stress on the job is going up. And it's not really good timing for me. What might be good timing for me might be, 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. But that's not convenient for the therapist. And so, there were a number of times where I would say, even if the therapy is doing something, and about a third of the time it absolutely wasn't, but even if it's doing something, is it doing enough to justify all the disruption to my life? And very often the answer was no. It's like, it's probably doing something, but by the time I've lost $400 in work revenue, paid $400 in therapeutic revenue, driven, frantically around, stressed myself out to be on time for the convenience of the therapist at their preferred location to do work in their way. I felt like, spending $800 going on a vacation might have been, significantly more healing. And so I actually pivoted more into travel and going to healing cultures, rather than doing therapy. And the final thing, in a culture that tends to pathologize healing. So in other words, the message is, in our culture, we focus on the individual. And so, there's a variety of things. The culture tends to shame people for needing help, which is part of the chauvinism of isolation and independence, that real important people don't need any help, that they're independent individuals. The fact that this is a myth doesn't matter. There's a message that you're not as valuable if you need help. That's a damaging message that unfortunately you can inflict on yourself or have inflicted on you by going to therapy. Number two, the idea is that if something is wrong, it's wrong with you. It's not wrong with the culture. Meaning it takes an entire culture to collude in sustained traumatic, emotional, and psychological illiteracy in order to produce trauma at the rate that we do. So the entire cult is colluding to create vast amounts of trauma. But when it comes time to treat the trauma, we don't treat the cult. What we treat is you, the individual. You are sick, and sick is bad. So you need to get help because you're weak. And so you need to drive to your therapist and do this. And that's a destructive message. And in many ways, the therapists focus on confidentiality. There's a lot of things that are neutral, and confidentiality is one of them. What if, rather than charging money to keep your truth confidential, therapists reported a census as part of their job of how many of their people were sexually abused, how many people were repeatedly traumatically abused, this and that and the other, and where the sources came from. And they were proud of gathering scientific data that showed the trends of increased or decreased abuse in different segments over time, and that your knowledge was actually, that your story and all these notes that the therapist takes down was actually educating the country on what is the biggest issues and how to deal with it. But they're not doing that. They're priding themselves on telling no one anything about a cultural epidemic, which of course, when needing anything is covered with shame, and sexual abuse is covered with shame, and bullying is covered with shame, and all of this stuff, it actually perpetuates the intergenerational abuse cycle. That being said, trauma is one of the few things that requires help by someone outside of the trauma. Now, this someone can be Christ. This someone can be Buddha. This someone can be an angel, an unseen friend, a kind human being, a rabbi, a pastor, a good friend, a trauma therapist. It can be, a loving parent, but it needs to be someone who is not intimidated with the energy, the intensity of the energy, that is emotionally literate, that is trauma literate, and ideally who is there because they care about you. That's the most healing medicine, is people care about me and so they're there. And this is a role for a possible therapist. Post-trauma, with therapeutic abuse, a I've taken a somewhat hard line on therapists, in part because I felt like my biggest jeopardy would be feeling humiliated and like a fool again for paying yet another incompetent professional, and feeling like I should have known better because there have been so many before. And, and that's obviously a sad thing, and it's one of the reasons why therapeutic abuse is such a big deal. That's a pretty big risk. I've also had some conflicts with the therapists that have kind of just been silent about this and haven't showed any interest in other victims and kind of bringing their colleagues to justice. And that has generally left me finding the therapist substandard and inadequate. Because they would tell me, in private, this is terrible, no one should do this. And it's like, okay, this is your profession, your colleagues, you have any interest in supporting this? And to a person, they've been frightened of encountering the other therapist, which, I can't say, that when you understand that your therapist is more loyal to their own fear than to doing the right thing by their client or the culture, it's not going to help you with trauma very much because you're terrified. And someone who might say a few nice things to you in private, as long as they're not on the hook, it's not in front of a camera or anything, is kind of a weak ally, someone who's going to melt away as soon as the shit hits the fan. And you don't need that, particularly when that has been a history in parenting and teacher of narcissistic individuals focusing on themselves. So I'm quite skeptical, but I know there are terrific therapists, and I also know that if you're fortunate enough not to be abused by a therapist, you have less of the hang-ups of the therapist to deal with. And so I think if you can do the work in meditation and with reading and prayer and massage and healing and things of that nature, if you can do that, that's a terrific thing to do, and it's often a good idea to learn about yourself in that way first, and to understand that there is a deep part in you that is capable of healing and that wants to heal, and that it is often cultural dogma, erroneous beliefs and fears, paradigms of materialism and things. There's often a variety of those culturally burdensome beliefs and thought processes that get in the way of that. But that innately, it is human nature to want to grow, to want to love oneself, and in healing and loving the self, then to move to love others. That this is our nature, and that it takes an incredible amount of cult interference to botch that up. And that if we will let go of some of the abuser often tries to transfer their shame or their sense of unlovability and valuelessness onto their victim. And so if you take that on, then you believe you're unvaluable, you're evil, you're bad, you're the problem. When you're carrying that belief, you're going to fight the healthy impulses that move towards your integration and your healing. And it's very important to find, a healer, a practitioner that knows this as well, and that understands that you're innate, that their job really is to clear off the cultural baggage, the cultural dogmas and weights that are burdening you down, so that your body can regenerate, that your mind can clear and come back to itself. And that is fundamentally good, that's fundamentally healthy. And that when it is expressing itself in highly destructive ways, it's usually a combination of ignorance and pain management, both of which have been imposed in a cultural framework of some kind.